Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the 55th of CG's webinar series, the 187th seminar CG's held. And I'm David Mills. I'm a research associate professor in the department and part of the CG research projects. But today we're really here to hear from Minto, Felix and Simon Marginson on universities and research in Australia, with a very aptly titled, Is Down Under Going Down Under? So the purpose of this talk really is to think about the consequences of COVID for the Australian higher education system, a system that's very much depended on international student mobility, a system that's been very quick to adopt a market-led model, and therefore possibly quite vulnerable to the consequences of what's happened with the pandemic. So both our presenters originally are from Australia, and of course both very concerned with Antipodean issues. So we've got some real experts here to help us think through this this talk. But before I start, you'll all know we have a few housekeeping things to talk about. So this will be recorded. So it's really important that you know that in terms of sorry, just going to take a second there. Sorry, there we are. Therefore, there'll be a transcript made in due course, and this transcript will be posted on the CG website, as will the webinar itself. And rules about keeping yourself muted unless you have a question. I think you all know this now, but there's no need to have the video on, but when it does come to question time, please do put it on so we can see who you are. You can use the chat function to bring up a question with me as we're going along. I'll organize a sort of speaking order for questioners. And then when you're asked to ask a question, just unmute yourself, switch on your video and state your name, where you're from. Great, so I think with no more ado, let's get straight into hearing from Simon, who of course you'll all know as Director of Centre for Global Higher Education. And we also welcome today Minto Felix, who's a first-year doctoral student in our department, who is going to be sharing this presentation with Simon. Simon and Felix, it's great to have you both. Thank you.
Well, thanks, David, for the introductions, and thanks, Minto, for joining me in the presentation. And I also want to thank Lynn Nguyen and a couple of other people from Australia who've managed to stay up late enough to tune in to this this webinar. But I understand that the YouTube video is likely to be picked up by a lot more people. I've had some mail from Australia, but as it is at this time of day, with the time zones currently as they are between UK and Australia with the 11-hour difference, it's difficult for Australians to participate, which is a pity, I think, because there's a lot that could be said by Australian participants in the webinar. The similarities between UK and Australia are always impressed when you move between the two science systems and the two university systems. You see remarkably similar cultures and people in similar in their cosmopolitanness too, although of course UK with more Europeans and Australia with perhaps more Asians, but on the whole, the openness of both systems has been a tremendous asset to each. And they've reached a very similar approach to both international education and science by somewhat different routes, with the Australian system being more dependent for its financing of basic science on soft money, on international student fees, than is the UK system, which has fairly carefully maintained a good balance, I think, between entrepreneurial generated income and basic funding by the state through a sophisticated and competent research system and its agencies. So let's pass to the next slide and see something of the history. In 1979, the UK Thatcher government, early stages, established full cost fee structure for international education, which was seen as quite surprising and revolutionary at the time, and it did turn out to be transformative in many respects in the longer term, although it wasn't immediately apparent. Now, Australia took a few years to follow, but in the mid-1980s, it set up two task forces which investigated the potential for marketing Australian education on a full cost basis in Asia, East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And it did subsequently establish a full fee structure and phased out the old subsidised limited places international student scheme that it had in place. By the end of the 80s, Australia had given the universities the right to set their own fees, and also reduced their per capita funding rate from government sources, so they were powerfully incentivized to begin to build full fee places and to set the fee at the kind of level which would get some money back from each student, instead of subsidizing international education as they had long done. And that was the beginnings of a upward surge in the international student market and the numbers in the 1990s in Australia. By the end of the 90s, international education was established as a large-scale operation, normalised in all the universities, with professional recruiting and student servicing in place. And the strength of the Australian approach to international education became, I think, the servicing of it. From the recruitment, enrolment, to the meet and greet, to the early stages of finding housing and welfare operations in place for the international students, Australia was perhaps stronger than the UK and most other countries. Academically, Australia never has had quite the same reputation as the UK and the US, but strong enough to sustain the this vast industry in Australia. And next slide, please, Minto. Now you can see from the previous slide that there was a dip in the late 2009, 10, 11, 12 period, and to some extent Australia's trajectory here is fluctuated a little more than the UK. In the UK, international student numbers have been really determined by the supply side, by the number of visas issued by the Home Office, because the demand is so high, there's always a queue outside the door. In Australia, more work had to be done to build demand, although the supply was relatively generous, with nearly all of the time, except for that dip about 10 years ago, the visa authorities being very generous in Australia to letting people in, providing that the minimal English language competences and so on were met. So Australia's growth trajectory has been, I suppose, more demand driven than the UK's. But in the last 10 years or so, it's been up. And by 2018, as the graph shows, Australia nearly reached the same level of international student numbers as the UK, although Australia's only got 38% of the population of the UK. So you can see how important international students are in Australian universities. By 2019, the next year of the UNESCO data not showing yet on the slide, Australia will have gone past the UK. And then, of course, Australia hit the wall called the pandemic, closed its borders to incoming flights, which the UK didn't do, and its numbers have dropped dramatically, as you'll see a little bit later from Minto in the presentation. Next slide, please, Minto. This gives us an idea of the level of dependency established financially in Australia, with about 1/3 of all students from all countries, 1/3 are from outside Australia, and nearly all of them face to face. There's not been an enormous amount of online education. There's some until the pandemic, which of course has brought about a lot more. But mostly face to face, and as you can see from the table, the students coming from different parts of Asia, East Asia, China especially, but also Hong Kong, and reasonable numbers a little bit below the countries listed from Japan, not many from Korea, a lot from Vietnam and from Southeast Asia, and always have been, and significant numbers from India, although the Indian entry has somewhat fluctuated. And Nepal, being a really big player, as it is in the UK, Nepal become a major provider of students, partly because of a lack of adequate tertiary places in Nepal itself, with 20% of the tertiary student population going abroad for international education. A pattern of great growth and coming from East, Southeast, and South Asia. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, when the pandemic hit and international students couldn't come in, and suddenly the budgets of the universities began to crash last year, the government showed little sympathy, it has to be said, for the predicament the universities were in. And there was much talk about a failed business model, as if the universities were wrong. It's important to put on record the fact that the business model, as was called, was established by government policy strongly supported by both sides of politics when they were in government. And that model essentially consists of government aiding recruitment through the embassy structure, supporting recruitment through the visa system, encouraging international student entry, managing it carefully in terms of welfare and consumer rights, and generally giving a lot of attention to what has become Australia's third largest export sector, and at the same time universities being incentivised to maximise their numbers as far as possible. So it's been very much a joint university government failed business model, if it's a failed business model. Of course, it is true, though, that this business model is vulnerable to a sudden downturn in numbers due to conditions that can't be controlled, that can't be managed on the supply or the demand side. And that, of course, is what is represented by the pandemic, but could also be represented by a major China-Australia imbroglio, which led to the cessation of most movement of students from China to Australia. I mean, that would also have a major effect on the market. So the Australian model was vulnerable, always to the big change in conditions. Although the smaller changes were managed, and successfully so, for a long period of time. Now, this graph shows you that the quality of Australian research has improved significantly since the mid-1990s. It shows you the percentage of science papers that are in the top 5% of their field as judged by citation rate from the Scopus data. And you can see there that it begins with about 6% of all of the Australian papers in the top 5%. So the world average 5% of all of papers, 6% in Australia were in that top citation category. But that grew as the graph proceeds until you get to 9% by 2016. And, that major change, which was shared by other English-speaking countries as a general trend, saw Australia improve its position compared to other English-speaking countries. And so, in fact, the proportion of papers in that top category in Australia reached the UK and US level round about 2010, 2011. And in fact, was also exceeded the Canadian level, which I haven't shown on the graph. And you can see that Australia's since then, in this category of top 5% papers, moved lockstep with the UK and well ahead of the US in terms of the proportion of papers in that top echelon. Next slide, please. Thanks, Minto. And now this is top 1% papers. This is the cream of science in terms of recognition anyway. We'll leave aside the question of to what extent citation papers are a good judge of value or merit, but let's assume that citation recognition does mean something, which it does. And this is about papers in the top 1%. Now you'll see there, of course, world average world 1% of papers are in the top 1%, clearly. But in Australia, in most disciplines, 2 to 3% of papers are in that top category, as is the case in the UK. And what's interesting is that if you leave out psychology and social science, Australia does better than the US in all areas, without exception, except, just psych and social science are below the line. And it does as well as better than, or a little bit worse than, the UK in every discipline. The Australian balls are the light blue ones, the UK balls are the white ones, and you can see they're bobbing around close to each other, well above the level of the US. So a very similar profile to the UK, in fact, strongly medical research, biomedicine, and all the applied life sciences. Australia's perhaps not quite as good in mathematics overall, but on this table has an identical proportion with the UK of papers in the top 1% in mathematics too. So Australia's doing tremendously well at the top end of science. And this is the first time in Australian history where Australia really has been that good. If you go back 10 years, you see, as the previous graph showed, a somewhat inferior performance compared to the UK. And if you go back 20 or 30 years, the gap is larger. Australia's come up to the UK level, albeit being a smaller country, in science overall, despite the fact, that it's more remote. It hasn't had the advantage of sitting next to that great pool of talent in Europe. So Australia has done really well, but it's been really due primarily to the extra income that has come from international student fees. Next slide, please, Minto. So why does this matter? How does this matter? Well, what happens is that, of course, science performance plays out in research element in university global ranking. all of the global rankings are research sensitive. And in the case of the Leiden ranking course or the academic ranking of world universities, primarily research based, directly so. In the case of the Times Higher and the QS, research is a big chunk, a big minority chunk directly of their index. But the research factor plays out heavily in their reputational surveys as well. So really, the role of research is larger in the QS and Times Higher than the table suggests. Research is really the most important single factor in establishing reputation. And that, of course, has played out very well for the Australians. Next slide, please, Minto. So you can see here that Australia's got 23 universities in the top 500 in the ARWU ranking, which is a reputable ranking of the multi-indicator kind, and almost one university per million people in the top 500. And that compares very favourably with the other countries in the table. For a country of 25 million, Australia is doing extraordinarily well to have 7 universities in the top 100. It's only got, its highest universities in the 30s, so it doesn't have an Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, Imperial in terms of the UK's performance. But once you take out that very, very top layer in the UK, Australia, of course, does just as well, and perhaps somewhat better in terms of the distribution of research strength within the country. Only one other country there, Switzerland, is as strong in the number of top 500 universities per million people, and the Australia's got almost one per million people, compared to the US having 0.41. So you can see how that Australia is relatively strong in terms of distribution and numbers. Let's have a look at that, the next slide, and you'll see that more clearly. Now here we have the 23 universities in the top 500, highest one at 35, only one in the top 50, but 7 in the top 100 and 23 in the top 500. And for a country of 25 million, it really is a great performance. I mean, only the Netherlands and Canada have a similar pattern of a very broadly distributed research strength in the way the Australians have achieved. And so not only has the international market helped to finance the top universities, it's helped to finance the next level, that's tier 2 as well, to become significant research and science players and therefore very strong recruiters in the international student market. So the wheel keeps turning. Let's have a look at the wheel then. Next slide, please. This is how it's worked. This sums up, I think, the Australian model. Income to support university facilities and research there on the right, 27% of that coming from international students. That income feeding into research costs, with about more than a quarter of research costs, and Minto will give you more detail on this, in the top 8 research universities coming from just directly from international student fees, so paid directly by those revenues. And that's a significant chunk of research. So you add that chunk every year for a succession of 20 years and you get a lot more research capacity building out of that. That additional funding feeding into the improved science outcomes, so that Australia's lifted itself from a second tier Anglo-American country to equally top tier Anglo-American country in science, albeit somewhat smaller than the US and the UK. That improved research performance in turn directly feeding into the rankings performance giving a signal to the international student market, to the parents, to the families, to the students themselves, that Australia has first-class universities and it's worth going there. And that sustains the numbers, which of course, and the growth of those numbers annually, which has been such a feature of the last few years. And that increased growth in numbers, that growth in numbers feeds straight into more research revenues and so on. So the circle turns. But the circle, of course, is no longer turning. And at this point, I'll hand over to Minto to tell us about the current situation.
Thanks, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. So turning our mind to the impact of the pandemic in relation to the research capacity and capability of Australian universities, we need to first understand the way in which Australia's managed the pandemic, which Simon mentioned at the beginning of his presentation. Australia's response to the pandemic so far has been characterised by prolonged periods of strict border closures from the world, as well as internally within its own borders, and also the sustained enforcement of state-mandated quarantine arrangements in hotels. This has meant that the country's had relatively modest impacts in relation to fatalities and cases, but of course a seismic impact on the university system. It's also worth noting at this point that at the very outset of the pandemic, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, encouraged international students to expressly go home, and so they did. So almost a year on, we see that as a consequence of the loss of international students, Australian universities have lost at least 17,300 jobs as a direct result of the pandemic, and an estimated $1.8 billion in revenue compared to 2019. These were figures that were just released last week by Universities Australia. In relation to the jobs lost, we know that this has been a combination of professional services staff, research staff, teaching staff, casual staff, and there isn't sufficient detail as yet on the precise breakdown of these figures. But most universities took an approach that was combining staff redundancies as well as non-renewal of contracts across various areas of university operations. What we do know is that the impact on research and that the research workforce is still very much to come across the sector, particularly if borders remain closed and international students are unable to enter Australia to resume their education. It's also worth noting that in terms of how universities manage costs, universities rationalise expenditure through suspending certain services, capital works and so on, as well as other types of non-salary expenditure, pausing travel, conferences, readjusting staff wages. The interesting thing also is while universities have really experienced this difficult period, at the same time they've been expressly unable to access the wage subsidy support from government, JobKeeper as it is known. This was made available for other areas of the economy, and in fact the government changed its rules 3 times to exclude universities from being able to access funds by changing the threshold that they had to demonstrate in terms of loss of revenue and then the categories. So providing such support could have been quite vital for universities, which may have seen them lose less staff. But unfortunately, this was not to be the case. Curiously though, highly profitable gambling companies were able to take advantage of the wage subsidy system. So make of that what you will. However, the government did provide a one-off injection in support specifically for research. So as I mentioned, the university system has lost $1.8 billion in 2020, and it's estimated to lose a further $2 billion this year. But at its November budget, the government kicked in $1 billion. Now, this funding is expressly for the research support program, which exists to support the research workforce, but of course is a significant shortfall between what universities would have expected to have received in pre-COVID times versus what has been provided to them now. And again, it highlights the importance of Australian universities for them to be developing sustainable forms of other sources of income beyond international students, whether it be philanthropy, industry, and other means. But the other point here actually is that on the point of industry, particularly among the leading research-intensive universities that Simon mentioned, they have increased their industry income quite significantly for research activity. Nevertheless, it does pale in comparison to the income that has come from international students. I want to say a bit more, if I can, about just how reliant or how essential international students have been to the research endeavour of Australian universities, and what that means moving forward. So there's a perception that universities have been greedy or perhaps irresponsible, but as Simon mentioned, it has been a making of government policy. In addition to the reasons mentioned earlier, unlike the US and the UK, for every dollar that universities receive from government in terms of competitively won research projects, they have to find themselves income to match that investment. In other words, there isn't a full and transparent costing of research activity. So what do universities do? They rely on discretionary income to make that work. Of the $12.2 billion on research spent in 2018, $6 billion was funded through discretionary income by universities, and of that $6 billion income in 2018, 51% of that discretionary income was through international students. So really, international students have been a significant proportion of this discretionary income funding. However, in a pandemic scenario, and drawing on the estimates of Marshall and Larkins, we are expecting to see that this discretionary income reduced to less than 30%, which is equivalent to a decrease of some $6.4 and $7.6 billion between 2020 and 2024, which is equivalent to just over 1/10 of the research workforce. While there has been a significant decline in international students, it is still worth noting that international students from China and those from India make up a significant share of the international student market. So this is the latest numbers we have of the total new commencements between July and November 2020. And we see here that despite the decline, students from China occupy a significant proportion of the overall market share. In terms of how Australian universities have engaged international students, as you would imagine, by and large, it has been through online education. But where it has been possible, universities have also prioritised pathway programs and using offshore campuses as almost staging posts, if you will, in being able to engage international students while they're in their home countries and to assist with their transition back to Australian shores. For example, the University of Technology Sydney used its offshore study centres in partnership with institutions such as Northeastern University in China and Vinh University in Vietnam to provide a physical learning space and extra support for coursework students enrolled at this institution. At the institution that I was working at last year, at Monash, there were real efforts to engage our Suzhou campus, where Monash has a presence, to be able to engage students in some level of blended delivery, with the view then to be able to nurture these relationships back to Australian campuses. Of course, it goes without saying that depending on the makeup and mix of international students within a university's campus, some were much more impacted than others. Moving beyond the impact of international student income and the implications of this to research capacity, the other important development in recent times in the Australian university system with implications for research has been the introduction of the Job Ready Bill. Again, as a response to COVID, but also more driven by the fact that there's an expected demographic increase in the number of 18 to 24-year-olds, the government has sought to increase domestic student places by creating an additional 100,000 places by 2030, but to do so within a fixed funding envelope. So this is their ambition. And the primary way they've sought to do this is by introducing greater variation in fees. So what this means is that while some students will pay less for their studies by being incentivized to pursue courses in the national interest, other students will pay significantly more. Overall, however, there is a greater burden in the shift of cost to the student, with the overall government contribution to higher education reducing from 58% to 52% per student. The other important thing in this bill, which is not fully explained in the slide, is that previously the funding allocations for domestic funding allowed universities to have some flexibility to use some of that money for research costs, student support administration costs as part of that discretionary capacity. But with this reduction in costs, universities will have, again, less funds to be able to spend that money on research. The things to notice, apart from the deficiencies in this legislation, as many would argue, as having disjointed and unclear aims, it does have some positive elements. For example, those students in rural and remote backgrounds, as well as Indigenous students living in rural and remote settings, will be now able to make use of a scholarship, a significant scholarship to help widen their access to education. But overall, this bill disproportionately affects those students who pursue humanities and social sciences, particularly those that are female, those from low socioeconomic backgrounds who pursue these courses in large numbers. So it is a bill of enormous contradictions that again impacts universities' abilities to invest in research. Further to the international student income loss, as well as this domestic policy that has just been introduced, we're also living through a time of some precarity in relation to Australia's relationships with China, which is a significant trading partner for the country, indeed for the Asia-Pacific region. And in turn, this is impacting Australian universities' research links with Chinese institutions. While some strains were already evident, tensions between Australia and China have really intensified in the wake of the pandemic. On one hand, Australia led the call internationally to investigate the origins of the pandemic, and on the other, the People's Republic of China responded with some sharp tariffs related to barley, suspensions related to beef, and soon thereafter, it has made its way to relations in international education and research. Over the last few months, and under, I guess, the banner of protecting the national interest, the Australian government has intervened into the research affairs of universities in fairly considerable ways. This includes the introduction of the Foreign Relations Bill, which affords greater powers to the government to overturn research agreements that have been entered into by universities as autonomous entities. There is also a review of the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, which is still underway, as I understand, but that many are concerned will provide government with unfettered ability to come into university campuses and investigate the use of critical research infrastructure. There's also a wide-ranging and quite hotly anticipated parliamentary inquiry into the national security risks affecting higher education and research, prompted in part by persistent reporting by sections of the Australian media. Yet at the same time, the government has taken a sustained interest to free speech on campus. There was an independent review, some may recall, into free speech on campus in 2018, which determined that there was no systemic free speech crisis. Nevertheless, there's been a subsequent review that took place last year into whether universities have adopted a code into a voluntary code. It was then about academic freedom. I mention these developments because on one hand, the government is particularly keen to see academic freedom enshrined on campus and freedom of speech, but one could argue that it is introducing measures that is seen to constrain university autonomy and in particular researcher autonomy. So where does this leave us on the geopolitics front? The implication of this, and I think the thing that concerns me the most, is to what extent sustained geopolitical tensions may deteriorate the strength and quality of global research activity. In addition to the developments just mentioned, only as recent as last week, the Chinese Ministry of Education again encouraged students to make a full risk assessment about studying in Australia. In fact, overnight, the Ministry of Education has announced a task force to investigate the quality of online education, the quality of education jointly delivered with Australian universities in China. There's also been concerns that have been propagated through media outlets and through the ministry about racism, anti-Chinese attacks, concerns about the pandemic. Some of these concerns may seem unsubstantiated and others may be very genuine. Nevertheless, if sustained, it could have some significant impact on the desire and willingness of international students from China to come to Australian universities. Yet on the other hand, we know that Australian universities are urgently seeking the return of international students and reassuring that their campuses are safe places. So at this point, I might conclude my contributions, but warn that ongoing and escalating tensions between these two countries amid global uncertainty may indeed impact Australia's research capacity, indeed the ability of the global research community to make significant advances in knowledge, knowing how significant these relationships have been. So with that, I'll go back to you, Simon.
Well, thanks, Minto. And this is just really to show that the Australian scientific engagement with China is substantial and on par with its engagement with the US and bigger than its engagement with the UK. So as in the US, where the scientific cooperation with China is the largest of all of the US's partnerships around the world, the Australian cooperation with China is very important. And so there's quite a lot at stake scientifically in terms of the, the future of these research relationships, which are now being swept up in geopolitics. But I mean, this hasn't been our main topic. Our main topic, I think, has been the state of the Australian universities financially in the wake of the COVID-19. But the coincidence of COVID-19 downturn in student numbers and income with the China imbroglio and question marks over the future of China-Australia science relations and the possibility of that playing out further in the international student market is certainly part of the mix. Over to you, David. I think.
Oh, sorry, Simon. I wasn't sure you were finishing. There was the last slide coming in there.
I think we're ready with the Q&A.
Great, brilliant. Thank you very much, Simon. Minto, that was really, really brilliant. Great review both Australian universities' dynamism, but also the way in which they are so vulnerable to this financial issue. And we're so lucky to have you, Simon, given that you've been writing about Australian education and higher education, and obviously your books on Monash, but for almost 30 years. So there's a lot of history that's really helpful here to understand what's going on. So some great questions in the chat, but I want to try one quick question to you both, which is, you presented this as a very proximate problem of the pandemic and the government responses. My understanding is that UK international student numbers didn't go down this year. So it wasn't inevitable, or was it? I mean, could the university system have responded more quickly with online provision and or other approaches for dealing with this?
You want to take it first, Minto? I'll follow.
I think, David, there is a particular challenge here around timing at which the pandemic hit Australia, and consequently the ability of international students who were planning to arrive into shores that then chose not to. A significant proportion of those students were captured through online education, but also many chose not to, or deferred, or so on. So I think the timing hit Australian universities more sharply, coupled with perhaps the messaging and some of the rhetoric that was around at the time.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I won't do the full comparison because I think Martin Dole's question is going to invoke that. But I mean, just to comment briefly, the Australians had to close the border. There was the right decision. And island countries, with the exception of the UK, which is so close to the continent, island countries can generally protect themselves well in the pandemic in a way other countries can't. And Australia and New Zealand have the same political and social culture as the UK and the US, could have had catastrophic pandemic casualty rates, except they were able to close the border and did so successfully, especially New Zealand, which is even more remote than Australia for world traffic. And Australia's got, my daughter's just flown back from the UK to Australia yesterday, and she's going to a country where there's no COVID-19 cases in Melbourne at all. There's none at the moment. So it's a totally different scenario. But in that circumstance, which is clearly that cripples in normal international education, you can talk about people going online and so on up to a point, but in the end, people want the face-to-face immersion experience, and they're going to go to Canada or UK where they can, or US, when they can get in, and they can get into UK. And the UK authorities have responded, I think, very cleverly and effectively to international student market problem in this period. The UK has basically said, all right, you universities, you've got to work at this, you've got to survive on your own behalf, but it's actually managed the Home Office visa approval process quite sympathetically. And as a result, the numbers 7% up from non-European international student entry in this academic year. I think every prospect that it'll be sustained, despite the problems the universities are having during the pandemic. The UK is actually going to earn more from international students than it's ever earned before, and is certainly going to increase its market share at a global level quite a lot, and go way past Australia even after the recovery occurs, when Australia had caught up, prior to the pandemic. So UK is certainly sailing through in terms of its outcome on international education. Australia stopped the market in its tracks, and in that circumstance, either it we compensated the institutions financially, especially for the research impact, or it didn't. And I think in response to Martin's question, I'll say why I think that happened.
Okay, no, that's brilliant. That's a useful starter. And I'll go straight to Martin with a really interesting question here about the sort of perceived reputation of universities and their pay of their vice chancellors. Martin, yours.
Well, thank you very much. I can say to Simon and Minto, two great presentations. And I can, from a personal point of view, testify to the quality of working with Australian universities and in Australia when I've been across. So reputation well established and really good partners. The question really is the impression created here of a real succeeding sector delivering benefit to Australia, both in terms of inward investment and also in terms of high quality research. And the question is why, given that being such a great asset to Australia, government has chosen not to support the universities through this period in order to allow them to get to the other side of it and to resume operations again. Is it because they'll be seen to actually be carrying large surpluses and reserves in their own accounts, and has an impression being created of those institutions living high on the whole in the past through successful months and years?
Do you want to go first, Minto? Because
I think you should go first, Simon. You can take the long view and I can come in.
Okay, I'll take the turn. Well, I think there's a perception in Australia that VCs are paid too much, and they're paid more than they are probably in comparative terms than in the UK, where it was such a big issue prior to the pandemic, as you recall. And that issue runs in Australia without question, and it a lot of people put a lot of energy into criticising VCs in one way or another for their rates of pay. And there's a perception, I think, with some justice that universities had large war chests, yes, built up primarily through international education. So they were certainly spending quite a lot of money on new facilities and buildings, which always gives the impression, with some justice, that there's money to burn, and the operation is becoming, by normal human standards, somewhat lavish. Those of us who try to renovate a house can reflect on the comparison between that and the new buildings springing up around the world, funded by the international student market. But there's more to it than that, and I think that's not the driver of government policy. I mean, it may be a backbencher response, but it's not the strategic response of policymakers. Now, there are differences between the UK and Australia, which I need to bring out. I mean, Martin, you said that that Australia's done so well in science and in international education, and yet it doesn't get the kind of credit at the core of the political system that you might expect for both of those things. And they're both seen as somewhat alien, I suppose, marginal to the real political game and the real policy focus and so on. I mean, the UK, I think, at the UK government, under a Conservative Party government and a Labor Party government, but particularly perhaps under a Conservative Party government, the commitment and understanding about research and science is profound. There's an understanding that is really central to what the UK is, that its achievements in science, to some extent, compensate for its, if you like, the fact that it no longer rules a quarter of the world. That it still is at the very forefront of many areas of human endeavour through the modern enterprise of science. And it's true. The UK in a range of scientific sectors is really strong and punches above its weight, as we know. And in that sense, the UK, smaller, but nothing to apologise for in comparison with the giant that is the USA and its science system. And that's a matter of national pride. I think runs a fair way down, despite the stuff about experts. That the science itself is seen as a positive thing, and no one would seriously consider dismantling the science system in the UK as a useful thing to do, as a justified redistribution of resources. It would just seem like vandalism, and probably worse than dismantling Shakespeare. It's in the modern period. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And it's not like that in Australia. See, there's a lovely quote that Michael Spence, who has just gone from Sydney VC to UCL VC like a couple of months ago, lovely quote in his farewell speech at Sydney at the end of last year. And he said, an Australian government economist once told me that there was not much value in doing research in this country because, given our size, we would always be an innovation importing country. We could just buy in whatever knowledge we needed, presumably funding the purchase by digging resources out of the ground and selling them, which is, of course, how Australia's primarily functioned, since its beginning as a settler state. Now, that is absolutely right, that there is Treasury is an intelligent Treasury, economically as competent as the British Treasury, which, of course, is the heart of British government. It's the same in Australia, but the Australian Treasury has this view that the science can come from the UK. Still the colonial mentality. Or it can come from the US. We can buy it from the US. So, no, not important for Australia to develop an equivalent capacity as the two larger English-speaking countries. And I think you saw that with the IT industry in Australia. It never got off the ground. It never had government support. And government deliberately said, we're not going to fund this. We're going to import the ideas from the US. So in these major areas of modernisation and innovation, Australia is still at the heart of government, has the view that we don't need to do this ourselves. And so this science effort by the universities building up phenomenal, especially, medical, biomedical and life science research But even in the physical sciences and engineering, it doesn't matter, doesn't rate as an achievement, as a priority. And the fact that universities chose to fund it themselves made it into their private good rather than a common good. So quite extraordinary, isn't it, that you'd think you allow a world-class science system to deteriorate. No other country in the world, I think, would do this. And every other country is trying to build a science system, one way or another, with scarce resources or with generous resources in some cases. So Australia's got this prize in its hand, and remarkably is letting it go over the next 5 years or so. But I think that you say, why would the Australian government do that? Is it Treasury? It's not just that. It's about politics. I don't think the Labor Party would have done this. It is the Liberal National Party government in this period, not always in the past, but in this period is doing this. And I think you can explain this by looking at how the coalition, particularly Liberal Party, sort of trains its apparatchiks and its operators, and it trains them in the Republican Party circles in the US, not the Conservative Party. I know Linton Crosby came from Australia to UK, but actually Australia draws more intelligence on its conservative side of politics now from the Republicans. And the Republicans have got this ideological view about universities, that they're captured by the Liberals, that they're liberal bastions who argue for gay marriage and this and that, or Indigenous rights, which is the thing that, and both those things make conservative political circles in Australia flare up. But, the whole apparatus of liberal concerns are associated with universities, probably quite rightly. They are hotbeds of for progressive causes in a liberal sense. And so, the way the Australian Conservatives approached this in the late 90s was to encourage marketisation, to introduce tuition fees at a higher level, to encourage the marketisation of international education more, and so on, thinking that getting the universities to become businesses would transform their culture. They would get rid of all this useless and dangerous social science and humanities with all these liberal ideas, because that wasn't economically functional. And they would just become just other businesses and practical. In fact, that didn't happen at all. They took the money that they were getting through their market operations to become more like they were before, that is, committed to basic sciences, humanities, and so on. And so flourished as universities in the sense that they have in the world rankings and so on. So, the Liberals and National Party have now changed tack, and they're saying the way to deal with this dangerous political enemy, the universities, is to cut them down to size financially by making their international student income wither, letting that happen, not fully compensating them for that, and also cutting their domestic student funding rate as well. That was remarkable, that they cut the domestic student funding rate, as Minto explained, in the middle of this crisis over international income, that it can only be construed as a deliberate campaign to weaken the universities as a political force in Australian society. And I do believe it will succeed to some extent.
Simon, that's brilliant. Anyone who tuned in thinking it was to talk about COVID is actually getting a wonderful historical political economy of Australian universities and their colonial history. Thank you. So that's great. So I'm going to take quite a few questions. I'm going to take 3 questions now, if I can, as a group, because I really want to get through these questions. So I wonder if I could ask Hongwei, and then Philip, and then Simon to give us the questions just briefly, and then perhaps you can respond to them as a group, Simon and Minto. Hongwei?
Yes. Thank you, Simon. That was very interesting. My question is, how did COVID-19 expose the underlying vulnerabilities of the regulatory governance of the sector? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That's a good question. Thank you. And Philip?
All right. Yes, mine is just a simple factual question. Do the international numbers reflect students only in Australia or at Australian campuses around the world? Is this the total number? Thanks.
Good. The demography really matters. That's great. And finally, Simon.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. My question is, obviously, I understand that Australia had to restrict access to the country by closing its borders. So that's going to have a consequence. But I'm interested in whether the discourses around this have been articulated in nativist or nationalist terms. Denmark, which is a very different system, has used, in a sense, has used this occasion as an opportunity to intensify nativist discourses around limiting international student access to higher education here.
Thank you very much, Simon. That's really interesting. So it's a great set of questions there, from practicalities to discursive politics and the culture wars again. But over to you, Simon Minto.
I might come in on just on Philip's question to say I'll actually take that on notice to double check the figures that I had on my slide, because some classifications tend to include offshore starts and some sort of separate them out. But I'll get back to you on that. But on the slide that I showed you, I'm almost certain that they are all international students in the totality, as it were. But I will double check that for you. And on the regulatory governance piece, which I think is a really, really important question, it has exposed some of those challenges, and there are live developments underway that are seeking to address that. For example, TEXA, which is the Office for Students equivalent, has set up a new integrity unit, which has quite a broad remit, but it is looking to investigate all manner of things, including the matters that we've discussed around proportion and mix of international students, for example, teaching standards, quality standards of education provision, including online, and that is jointly delivered. But it certainly has, and I think there's more to come in that space.
Thank you.
Yeah, quickly in response to all three, I mean, I think in relation to what Hongwei has asked, yes, I mean, I think you're right to raise that, I suppose, that way of thinking about the problem. What changes should have occurred or could occur in the regulatory governance framework to, avoid this happening again, if you like. Well, I mean, I think what we've got here is a situation where you've got normal business and then you've got active God, factor coming in. Now, obviously, an insurance company, can say, okay, we'll, if there's an act of God, we can compensate you for your business being washed away, because you can't be expected to earn revenues in the normal way when your business has been washed away by a flood. It's in this case, what the government has done is it said, we expect universities to manage their own affairs. We expect them to raise their own part of their own income. We expect them to deal with shortfalls in the income they raise on a normal basis. But when the conditions that enable them to earn their income at all disappear, then of course that raises the question of what you then do. Now, it seems to me that if you make self-regulation the absolute principle, you let them sink. Or if you make self-regulation the principle, but then give a minor compensation, a minority compensation, which is what happens, you let them sink more slowly. Or you say, okay, this is a one-off, we're going to compensate you adequately, but we expect this compensation to be progressively withdrawn as soon as we can. So you get back to normal and become self-responsible in the normal way in future. And that would have been the optimal policy, I think, from an Australian government point of view. Instead, they've allowed something negative to happen, which presumably they wouldn't have said in there openly that they wanted to happen before the pandemic occurred. So yeah, the flaw is, I think, in the basic settings, the notion that self-regulation is absolute, responsibility or near absolute, and government doesn't have to step in. And I think the UK government probably would have saved the science base if it had been under the same kind of pressure. It would have put that under priority, and looked at it, the possibility of having to do that, and nearly did, and decided, no, I don't think we need to do it this way. Let's try and do it the other way, and the other ways worked. So their judgment was pretty astute, as I think Mike Shaddock was saying when it was happening, and perhaps no one else was. On the second question, the IBCs, I think international branch campuses are in the data, yes, as Minto said, Phil, but they're not a very large factor. There's quite a lot of online education, that's a bigger factor. But it's surprising that offshore enrolments are only about 20% of the totality. The IBCs themselves are quite a small proportion. And there's not as much, they're not as large. As you might think, the Vietnam campus of RMIT, I think, is the largest, with about 5,000, 6,000 students. And there's a number like the ones in Malaysia, for example, only 2,000 students or so, and they're individually, and they're not a big factor in the 500,000 figure, which is the total enrolment prior to the pandemic. Simon's question, the nativism, is that a factor? You know, it has been in the past. In round about the dip in enrolments in 2010 was partly migration resistance and a feeling that international students were part of that migration resistance. Had both sides of politics saying we've got to reduce international student intake. Migration's getting sensitive in the outer suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, and particularly, but also elsewhere. Too many migrants, too many international students and so if we reduce the number of international students, we can reduce the heat on migration. And there was a period of a dip, and there was a certain amount of nativist rhetoric around at that time. In the latest period, not much. We've heard of lots of racist incidents, many affecting Chinese students in recent years, but not the sort of generalised politics of nativism or racism at this point of time. It's always possible in Australia that the old white supremacy hasn't disappeared in Australia either. Those sensibilities can be touched off, but at this point of time, anyway, that's not part of the discussion of international education, fortunately. You're muted, David.
Thank you very much. Sorry, that's really helpful, Simon, to sort of get those responses. I think we've got time for just 2 more questions, if that's possible, briefly, from Lynn and Elisa.
Yes, thank you, David, and thank you, Simon and Minto. I would like to have a question on the role of network governance and the status of the Group of 8 in the Australian higher education system. So in your view or in your research, do you think that the university in the Group of 8 have more privileges than other institutions in terms of funding or recruiting students or expanding their physical campuses? And if there is any of such privileges, do they contribute to improving the system, or do they contribute to the maintenance of the common good of higher education?
Great, thank you. And a last question from Elisa.
Thank you. My question is about the response from higher education staff and students. How have they responded to this? Although after hearing the very bleak picture Simon has outlined, maybe it doesn't matter what they think. I don't know. Thank you.
Great, really, that's really helpful, Elisa. Let's see what Simon meant to pick about.
Do you want to go first, Minto?
Yeah, happy to. Alyssa, good to see you again. On the student staff response, there was, as you would expect, enormous outcry on Twitter. And I think particularly from a staff perspective, there was quite a lot of concerted effort through the union, the National Tertiary Education Union, to arrive at an agreement about a framework by which job losses could be minimised, around what other conditions or things could be foregone to avoid and sort of minimise the impact. And unfortunately, despite, I think, intentions on both sides, though the framework was agreed to, it was not always adopted by individual institutions. And so there wasn't this sense of a concerted, we're all in this together kind of pursuit, within the sector itself. So let alone, having a united front towards government perhaps made the sector a bit weaker, would be my personal view. On Lynn's question, very briefly, I'm not so sure about privileges, but I think in terms of research and research output and sort of weight of research, the Group of 8 universities do carry a very heavy load, and also they do, as per the, despite what you make in terms of national rankings, they conduct most amount of the high impact, high quality research that's sort of measured as world leading or above world leading. And so they actually have the most to lose in terms of research workforce and research standing from this crisis.
I mean, the question of this stratification of the system is a long discussion, as you know, Lynn. It's as you are at Monash, as I was once. You know that Monash is a very, and Minto was too, a very large university with tremendous pulling power offshore, because it's a large science engine with great rankings and in this present period, and great corporate capacity to to build itself on any front. I think the Australians are probably as strong or stronger than the UK universities on the business and entrepreneurial and servicing side, as I said before. And Monash is perhaps the example of that. They're all the top 8 there's a big gap between them and the rest in terms of their research position. their research outputs and their research resources and income. And they're also tremendously powerful engines for international student recruitment. But there are others who are also good at that. And there's a large number of institutions with more than 12,000 students, international students onshore normally, pre-pandemic anyway. So it's not just the G of 8, but the G of 8 can more or less decide how many students it takes. Its demand supply position is that strong. So it's really is well placed. And like all universities, it's more about building reputation and so on than anything else. But their overall income position in the last 20 years has got very, very strong until the pandemic. So yes, they're in a strong position. They don't have special funding from government like they do in some countries. I mean, the UK funds its top universities, top research universities very well through the REF distribution. That sustains its kind of, if you like, that's its hidden world-class university policy, and it doesn't declare it as such, but it sustains the position of Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, Imperial, Edinburgh, and so on, through its REF distributions as much as anything else. In Australia, though, it's been the universities themselves that reproduce their position, except in this one important respect. The G of 8 inherited a very strong position at the beginning of what you might call the present regulatory era, which at the end of the 1980s, the G of 8 went into the competitive national system that was then established, and a partly fee charging one as it was then for the first time. They went into that much higher, in a much stronger position than the other institutions, all of the other institutions, and they've essentially maintained that lead almost exactly as it was 30 years ago, in the reproduction of the system. So yeah, G of 8, very privileged. On Eliza's question, I won't answer at length, David, but just simply to say, Eliza, it's different to the UK. There's no liberal media in Australia. There's the Australians like Fox News, and that's in some people's eyes, that's the quality newspaper. And it's very ideological and very, very pro right-wing side of the coalition at the moment, and very Trumpish, at the moment in Australia. And what was the strong media in terms of a more left of centre or centre position, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age are really quite weak. Small journalist stables now, and lots of part-timers, and their websites are terrible. Nothing much there. I mean, the Guardian, the Independent, they give you a lot more. The Financial Times gives you a lot more, much more than the Financial Review in Australia, although the Financial Review, which has got a small circulation, largely to business, is probably the best newspaper now.
So we've started with the topic of COVID, but actually we've got this great insight into political culture in Australia. We've been very lucky to have such expertise and such a fresh set of eyes on this situation. I think it would be nice if the policymakers were listening. They're probably all asleep, but hopefully some of this will get back. I'd like to go off script here a bit and express our appreciation to Simon and Minto. If you could all just unmute yourself for a second, and a quick round of applause would be very nice for them.
Innovation in the chair.
Thank you very much for that, and I welcome you all back on Tuesday of next week for part 2. Simon is presenting with Xin Xu a really interesting paper on hegemony and inequality in global science, problems of the center periphery model. I've seen the paper; it's fascinating. So I hope you'll join us again, and of course join us at all our CG webinars. You're always welcome most Tuesdays and Thursdays. Thank you all for coming today, and see you all soon.